Tonight, we are entering one of the most tense and tragic stories in 1 Samuel, the story of a war that seemed to end on the battlefield, but continued inside a king's heart. This is the story of Saul, the first king of Israel, and David, the young man who helped save Israel but became a threat in the eyes of the very king he served. The question guiding this story is simple and unsettling. Why did Saul, a king chosen to protect Israel, begin to see David, the one who helped rescue Israel, as an enemy who had to be destroyed? In this part of the Bible, the danger does not stay where we expect it. At first, it stands outside Israel in the form of enemy armies, iron weapons, and a giant warrior named Goliath. But after Goliath falls, the story grows darker. The battlefield moves into the palace. The sound of war changes from shouting soldiers to quiet footsteps in royal rooms, from clashing swords to the sudden flight of a spear across a chamber. The image at the center of this story is simple. Saul sitting in the dim light with a spear in his hand while David plays music nearby. One man holds a weapon, the other holds a harp. One is still the king, the other is not yet on the throne. But the future seems to be gathering around him. And that is where the mystery begins. The war outside may have paused, but Saul never truly put down his weapon. Before Israel had a palace, a royal court, and a long line of kings, it had fear. The people lived among stronger enemies, uncertain borders, sudden attacks, and the memory of battles that could rise again without warning. They were not yet a kingdom in the way surrounding nations were kingdoms. They were tribes bound by covenant, memory, worship, and crisis, often led by judges, elders, and prophets when danger came. In 1 Samuel, the people begin to ask for something more visible. They want a king. They want someone who can stand before them, gather them, lead them out, and fight their battles. To a frightened people, a king feels like safety made human. He is the figure at the front of the army, the one whose height, armor, and command can make a nation feel less exposed. The prophet Samuel warns them that kingship will come with a cost. A king will not only protect, he will also take. He will take sons for war, servants for labor, fields for his needs, and the strength of the people for the machinery of his rule. The biblical text does not present this moment as simple politics. It presents it as a spiritual turning point, because Israel's desire for security is mixed with a deeper unease about trusting the God who had led them before they had a throne. Still, the people ask, and into that desire steps Saul. Saul appears like the kind of man a frightened nation would notice. The Bible describes him as impressive in appearance, a man who stands taller than the people around him. In a world where war is visible and physical, height matters, presence matters. When people are afraid, they often look for someone who seems strong enough to carry their fear for them. At first, Saul does not appear as a monster or a villain. He is a man drawn into a role larger than himself. He becomes Israel's first king, and with that crown comes a terrible weight. He must carry not only his own fear, but the fear of a nation that wanted a human shield between itself and danger. This is why the spear matters from the beginning. At first, a weapon in a king's hand makes sense. Israel wanted someone who could fight. They wanted a defender. The king's weapon represented protection, order, and strength against enemies who threatened the people from outside. But in biblical stories, symbols often change as the heart changes. A weapon meant to guard a people can become a weapon turned inward. A crown given for service can become something a man tries to protect at any cost. Saul's tragedy is not that he begins with a spear. His tragedy is that he will not know when to put it down. The early story of Saul contains moments of courage and real leadership. He is not flat or simple. He is not introduced only as a failed man. That makes his fall more painful. The viewer should feel the danger of his story, because Saul begins as someone who might have become steady, humble, and strong, but instead begins to bend under the weight of fear, image, and control. There is something almost quiet about the danger at first. It does not begin with Saul throwing a spear across a room. It begins with a nation asking for strength, and with a man being placed beneath a burden that will reveal what is already inside him. A throne can raise a person high enough for everyone to see, but it can also expose every weakness that was once hidden in ordinary life. Israel asked for a king to bring stability, but kingship does not remove fear from a nation if fear becomes the force shaping the king himself. The people wanted someone to go before them in battle. What they could not yet see was that a battle can continue long after the soldiers return home. And the first battlefield Saul would lose was not made of dust and stone. It was hidden inside the place where obedience, trust, and power meet. The fracture in Saul's reign begins before David becomes famous. It begins before the songs in the streets, before the spear in the palace, before the king looks at the young hero and sees a rival. David does not create Saul's deepest wound. David reveals it. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul is given a command concerning Amalek, an enemy remembered in Israel's story for violence against the vulnerable during the wilderness journey. The details are harsh and difficult for modern listeners, and the story belongs to an ancient world of war, judgment, and sacred command. What matters for this documentary is the role this moment plays in Saul's kingship. Saul does not fully obey, and when Samuel comes to meet him, Saul tries to present the scene as obedience, but the truth will not stay hidden. The sound of the animals exposes the gap between Saul's words and Saul's actions. Samuel asks why he hears the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle if Saul has truly done what he was commanded to do. It is a quiet but devastating moment. The king's public version of events begins to collapse under the sound of what he tried to keep. Saul explains, shifts, and defends. He speaks of sacrifice. He speaks of what the people did. Eventually, he admits something that will echo through the rest of his life. He feared the people and listened to their voice. This is not a small confession. The man chosen to lead Israel is being led by the pressure around him. Samuel's response is severe. The prophet says that because Saul has rejected the word of the Lord has rejected him as king. Saul is still standing there. He still has his royal position. The people may still see him as their ruler, but inside the story, something has already changed. Then comes one of the most cinematic images in Saul's life. As Samuel turns to leave, Saul reaches for him. The edge of Samuel's robe tears. In that ripped fabric, Samuel sees a sign. The kingdom has been torn from Saul and given to another. This is where the crown begins to tear. Saul still wears it, but the story has already told us that it will not remain whole in his hands. He still sits on the throne, but a future has been announced beyond him. This is not yet a public transfer of power. There is no coronation scene replacing him. There is no army suddenly turning to another leader. The tear is quieter than that. And because it is quiet, it is more haunting. Saul's deepest fear now has a shape, even if he does not yet know the name attached to it. Someone else will receive what Saul cannot keep, somewhere beyond his sight. The future is moving. The tragedy is that Saul does not respond to this loss by becoming free from the throne. He becomes more attached to it. He asks Samuel to honor him before the elders of the people and before Israel. He still wants the public shape of kingship preserved. Even as the spiritual foundation cracks, the visible image must remain standing. This is one of the most important layers of the story. Saul's problem is not only disobedience, it is the desperate need to keep appearing whole after the tear has already happened. He wants honor in front of the people, even when the prophet has named the truth beneath the surface. In animation, this moment should feel almost still. Samuel turns away. Saul reaches out. Cloth tears in the silence. The sound is small, but the meaning is enormous. A kingdom does not always begin to collapse with shouting armies or falling walls. Sometimes it begins with a torn edge of fabric in the hand of a king who cannot let go. The viewer should not rush past this moment without it. Saul's later hatred of David can look like sudden jealousy. With it, that jealousy becomes the continuation of something older. Saul is already living with the knowledge that his kingdom has been judged, that someone else will come, and that the future is no longer safely inside his grasp. So when David later appears, David does not need to attack Saul to become dangerous. He only needs to exist. He only needs to succeed. He only needs to be loved by the people and favored in the story. Saul will look at him and hear again the sound of torn fabric. The crown has begun to tear, but Saul has not yet put down the spear. While Saul remains on the throne, the story quietly moves to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and to a young man who does not yet look like a king in the public eye. His name is David. He is not introduced first through a throne room, a royal army, or a political claim. He enters through a quieter doorway, as the youngest son, a shepherd, someone called in from outside when Samuel comes looking for the one God has chosen. The biblical text says Samuel anoints David, and from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, but David does not immediately take Saul's place. This is important. The Bible creates a long and tense space between being chosen and being crowned. David carries a future that has not yet become visible to everyone around him. Meanwhile, Saul continues to rule. Yet the text also says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit troubled him. This language belongs to the biblical world, and it should be handled with care. The story is not asking us to flatten Saul into a modern psychological diagnosis, and it is not inviting us to turn the moment into spectacle. What matters for the story is clear. Saul is no longer at peace within himself. His servants search for someone who can play music to soothe him. David is brought into the royal house because he can play the lyre or harp, and because he is known as capable, brave, and favored. Before he becomes the object of Saul's fear, he becomes a source of relief. Before Saul throws a spear at him, Saul depends on the sound of his music. This creates one of the most powerful contrasts in 1 Samuel. The future king enters the house of the rejected king, not with a sword raised, but with strings beneath his fingers. He does not storm the palace. He serves in it. He does not announce himself as Saul's replacement. He sits close enough to the troubled king to bring calm into the room. Imagine the scene in animation: a dark royal chamber, stone walls warmed by torchlight, Saul sitting heavy with unrest, his face half-shadowed, while David plays softly nearby. The music does not solve everything. It does not undo the torn robe. It does not heal the fracture between Saul and God. But for a time, it lightens the room. That temporary peace makes the coming violence more painful. David is not first presented to Saul as a rival. He is presented as help. He is the young man whose music allows the king to breathe again. The one who will later flee through the night, once sat near enough to Saul to comfort him. There is also a quiet irony here. Saul's house receives the very person who represents the future beyond Saul. The palace opens its doors to David without fully understanding what has entered. He is useful, gifted, and soothing. But beneath that ordinary usefulness is a hidden anointing. The future does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives carrying an instrument. Here the central question deepens. Why would Saul come to hate someone who had helped him? Why would a king turn his weapon toward the very person who brought relief into his house? The answer will not come all at once. It will form slowly, through victory, public praise, and the terrible way fear listens to other people's admiration. David's presence is gentle now, but the secret anointing still hangs over the story. The audience knows something the palace does not fully understand. The future is already in the room. And Saul, though he does not yet see it clearly, is sitting near the man whose existence will one day force his deepest fear into the open. The battlefield where David becomes famous is not quiet. It is filled with fear, shame, and waiting. Israel stands facing the Philistines, and between the two armies comes Goliath, a warrior from Gath whose size and confidence turn the battlefield into a place of humiliation. Day after day, he challenges Israel. Day after day. The soldiers hear him and shrink back. Saul, the king chosen to lead Israel in war, is also afraid. This matters deeply. The man who was meant to stand at the front of Israel's fear is himself caught inside it. The nation wanted a king who could go before them into battle. But now the king stands with the rest of the army, unable to answer the giant's challenge. David arrives as someone who does not fit the scene. He is young, not dressed like a warrior, and not carrying the kind of armor that makes armies feel secure. He has come from the world of sheep, fields, and ordinary obedience. Yet he hears Goliath's challenge differently from the others. To David, this is not only a military insult, It is a defiance against the living God of Israel. The confrontation with Goliath is one of the Bible's most famous scenes. But in this documentary, it must not be treated as the end of the story. It is a doorway. David steps into the open space between two armies, and the giant who terrified Israel falls. The visible enemy collapses. The soldiers who had been frozen in fear surge forward. The shame lifts for a moment. It looks like the war has turned toward victory. Israel has found courage again. Saul's army has been delivered from the shadow of Goliath. The young man with the harp is now also the young man who stood before the giant and lived. But then the story changes its lighting. As David returns from victory, the women come out from the towns of Israel with singing and dancing. Their song is joyful, but its words strike Saul like a hidden blade. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The song is not presented as a conspiracy. It is public celebration. It is the language of a people rejoicing after fear has been broken. But Saul does not hear it as joy. He hears comparison. He hears loss. He hears the future moving towards someone else. The biblical text says Saul became very angry, and from that day on he kept his eye on David. That phrase is quiet, but it changes the story. Saul's gaze has shifted. David is no longer only the young man who plays music. He is no longer only the servant who helped the king. He is now the figure standing between Saul and the security Saul is desperate to keep. This is the turning point where victory becomes a threat. Goliath's fall should have brought relief to Saul. Instead, it exposes Saul's wound. The battle outside has ended, but inside the king, another battle begins. The tragedy is that David has not attacked Saul. He has not claimed the throne. He has not raised a rebellion. He has simply done what Saul's fear could not do. He faced the enemy, and the people saw him. In a kingdom shaped by war, public praise can feel like power changing hands. Saul hears the numbers in the song and imagines the next number, the kingdom itself. The women have sung of thousands and 10,000s, but Saul's mind moves to the throne. If David has more praise, what else will he have? This is how fear transforms reality. A song becomes a warning. A servant becomes a rival. A victory becomes evidence of danger. The same David who brought music into Saul's troubled room now brings unrest simply by being celebrated. And here, the story becomes especially painful. Saul should have been able to rejoice that Israel had been delivered. He should have seen David's courage as a gift to the nation he was called to lead. But fear has a way of shrinking the world until every blessing feels like competition. What saved Israel now feels to Saul like the thing that may destroy him. The viewer should feel the irony clearly. Israel's enemy has been defeated, but Saul does not become free. The giant has fallen, but the king's fear stands taller than before. The war did not end. It entered Saul's imagination, and from there, it began looking for a target. David returns to the palace, changed in Saul's eyes. He is still David, still the young man who served, played, fought, and obeyed. But Saul now sees him through the shadow of a torn kingdom. The battlefield has followed them home. The next scene brings the whole tragedy into one room. David is playing music in Saul's house, as he had done before. The room should feel familiar to the viewer by now. Torchlight, stone, silence, a troubled king, and the sound of strings trying to soften the air. But something has changed. Saul is sitting there with a spear in his hand. This is the image that carries the documentary. The harp and the spear are in the same room. David brings music. Saul holds violence. One instrument is meant to calm. The other is meant to pierce. And between them is the unseen weight of a crown Saul knows he cannot fully keep. The biblical text says Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but David escaped. It is a sudden act, but not a random one. Everything before it has been moving toward this throw: the torn robe, the secret future, the harmful unrest, the victory song, the jealous gaze, the fear that David was rising where Saul was falling. In that moment, the palace becomes a battlefield. This is no longer Israel facing Philistines in an open valley. There are no armies shouting across the ground. There is no giant standing before the ranks. There is only a king and the young man who served him. And the weapon meant for enemies is now flying through the royal house. The story repeats this danger again. Saul again seeks David's death, and again the spear appears. The repetition matters. Saul's violence is not a single passing impulse. It is becoming a pattern, a way of reacting to the future he cannot control. He cannot unhear the song. He cannot undo Samuel's words. He cannot make David less loved, less favored, or less alive in the imagination of the people. As Saul's fear grows, the damage spreads through his own house. Jonathan, Saul's son, loves David and makes a bond with him. This is not only political tension, it is family grief. Jonathan stands between blood and truth, between loyalty to his father and recognition that David does not deserve death. The war inside Saul begins to divide the people closest to him. Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, also becomes part of the escape. When Saul sends men to watch David's house and kill him, Michal helps David flee through a window in the night. The image is quiet and urgent. A man once celebrated in the streets, now slipping into darkness, helped by the daughter of the king who wants him dead. This is where David's path changes. He moves from palace rooms into wilderness spaces. He leaves behind the music chamber, the royal table, the public praise, and the dangerous nearness of Saul. The future of Israel does not march directly to the throne. It escapes at night. And Saul remains behind with the crown and the spear. The contrast is powerful. Saul still has visible power. He has command, title, soldiers, and royal authority. David has none of that in a secure form. He has danger, uncertainty, and the long road of waiting. Yet the story has already begun to show where the future is moving. David's restraint will matter later in the larger story, because he will have chances to harm Saul and will not seize them as Saul seized the spear. But even here, at this stage, the contrast is already visible. Saul turns fear into violence. David survives without becoming the same kind of man in return. This is one of the most important emotional turns in the story. David is not merely escaping danger. He is being pushed into a different kind of formation. The wilderness will become the place where he learns delay, hunger, loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of waiting for a promise without forcing it into his own hands. Saul's palace could have been a shortcut to power, but it becomes the doorway into exile. The palace was meant to be the center of order, but under Saul, it becomes a place where music cannot safely be played, where family members must choose sides, where a king's hand turns against the one who helped Israel. That is the heart of the title. The war ended, but no one put down their weapons. Or more precisely, Saul did not. The tragedy is not that Saul had enemies. Israel truly had enemies. The Philistines were real. The battlefield was real. Goliath was real in the story's world. The tragedy is that Saul's fear no longer knows where the enemy is. It begins outside the borders, but ends by pointing the spear inside his own house. By the time David disappears into the night, the viewer should feel that something irreversible has happened. The conflict is no longer only about who is stronger. It is about who can live without being ruled by the need to control what God has already set in motion. Saul fights the future with a weapon in his hand. But the more he fights, the more he reveals that the future has already begun to move beyond him. At the end of this part of 1 Samuel, the image that remains is not only David before Goliath. It is Saul in the dim room, still armed after the battle should have been over. The giant has fallen. The songs have been sung. The young hero has returned. But inside the palace, the king still grips the spear. That is what makes the story so haunting. Saul was chosen in a time of fear, raised up to defend Israel from enemies beyond its borders. But slowly, fear entered the place where wisdom should have lived. The weapon that once represented protection became the sign of a man trying to fight loss, judgment, comparison, and the future itself. David's story is not yet complete. He has not taken the throne. He has not become the king Israel will later remember. For now, he is a man escaping through the night, carrying a promise he cannot yet fully see. The road before him will be long, and the wilderness will test him in ways the palace never could. But Saul's tragedy is already clear. He still has the crown, yet he has lost the peace that would have allowed him to wear it well. He still has a weapon, yet he can no longer clearly see whom it should be used against. He still has power, but power has become a room with shadows on the wall and a spear in his hand. The war ended, but Saul did not put down his weapon, and in that refusal, 1 Samuel shows something quiet and terrible. Sometimes the most dangerous battles are not the ones fought before armies. They are the ones carried home afterward, into houses, into families, into memory, into fear. The story leaves us with a silence after the music stops. A king remains in the palace. A young man disappears into the wilderness. And somewhere between them, the future of Israel has already begun to leave one hand and move toward another.